to first of all introduce the first speaker, Dr. Bryan Kauma, who is a research fellow at Stellenbosch University and lecturer in African history at Durham University. And his research interests are on the social and environmental history of African society, and that's a fascinating, point of view that he's going to bring to our conference, with a particular attention to food histories and how these histories offer a lens into understanding the complex human environmental relationship over the time. And using narratives of marginalized crops, he has explored how different foods tell the interesting and often understudied history of a small community surviving in the ever-changing global space. Today, he is going to speak on hunger and power, politics, food insecurity, and development of small grain in Zimbabwe, 2000 to 2010. So, Dr. Kauma, the floor is yours. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. Can I share my screen? Can you please confirm if you can all see my screen?
Yes, that's perfect.
It's showing. All right.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, everyone, for coming today. I want to say good morning because it's 7 a.m. this side, but I know it's in the evening or afternoon where you guys are. So as has been said, my name is Bryan Kauma, and this research that I'm going to be talking about today comes off my PhD thesis that was done at Stellenbosch University. And I'm in the process of trying to think and shape all these ideas into what will arguably be my first sole-authored monograph. So I'll be talking about small grains. Small grains is the title that is affectionately used to talk about millet, sorghum, and what we also call rapoko in one of the indigenous languages, which will be pearl millet. For a talk for another day, there's politics on the different names of these different grains that came about with the colonial era, and how colonialism came and changed some of the names because of pronunciation differences and economic differences by the settler state within the continent. But what's essentially important for us perhaps to know at this point would be that these small grains were used for food and consumed by both Black and white communities, the African and European communities within this space from as early as the pre-colonial era right up to present. And so this is a quick map of the distribution of small grain, current distribution of small grain and different grain production within Zimbabwe. And Zimbabwe is a country in Southern Africa. Africa is a continent. I put the small little picture at the top. And so if you look at this map, a lot of the areas that are shaded in green and in red, those are arid, dry regions within the country. And so there's very low rainfall, it's dry, and maize doesn't do so well in these regions. And if you notice, it's literally the bulk of the whole country that experiences and enjoys doesn't enjoy, but undergoes these arid regions. And so the production of small grains becomes very important and pertinent agrarian process within the economy and the state. But as you'd realize in my discussion, this was not the case from the colonial period, where white settlers came in and tried to change the agricultural ideas and replace small grain production with maize. And so that idea was also perpetuated by the post-colonial government as well, for issues which I'll get more deeply into. But in essence, because of the politics around grain, with the substituting of small grains with maize, you now have a point where, as climate change and Anthropocene and different environmental changes take place, you have food insecurity and hunger becoming more prevalent within the country. And so the two maps then also show you the distribution of where hunger is most affected across the country. And more importantly, if you realize it's in the areas where you have a lot of maize production being encouraged, and yet the preferred and the most viable crop for them to grow would be the small grains, according to our maps. And so because of these ideas of substituting maize with small grains, agricultural outputs are no longer as good as expected. And so hunger and food insecurity become a reality of many people. So this study allowed me to explore two personal advances. One, it allowed me to explore my methodological boundaries in so much as speaking about issues of hunger with different people. Now, I'm not sure of different other cultures, but there's a taboo or an embarrassing association with admission of being hungry because hunger is associated with poverty. And so when you try to engage with people and you're speaking issues about hunger and poverty, sometimes you don't really get the responses that you want. And more importantly, and increasingly, as this research is also going to show, is that conversations about hunger became very political. Whenever you went to any community and you spoke about hunger, or you spoke about issues of food, there was a lingering idea amongst the people that you're speaking to that you want to come and donate food to them. And so some of the answers that you'd be getting would become very skewed and very tilted in favor of not jeopardizing their chances of getting food. So in some cases, you'd get into a house in the rural areas because not everyone economically is the same. You see people are eating and you get into the house and they say, no, you can come in for an interview. And then when you ask them, so what did you guys eat these past few days? Have you guys eaten any meat or any chicken? Even though you can see it's in the plates that they're eating, they'll go and say, no, we've not eaten any of that. We're starving. We only had 1 meal a day. And some of the narratives that they'll be sharing are in knowledge that if they go and say that, yes, we've eaten meat, which is then perhaps at that moment viewed as a luxurious food, they might jeopardize their chances of getting that food aid and the donations that you want to give. And so you then see that conversations on food and culinary research become very contested. There's always a politics in it. And so the study allowed me to then explore and see how best I can unearth these contestations. But a quick and brief history that also informs the current context in which we'll be speaking about, as I've highlighted, is the colonial shift from small grains production to maize. And this was over the colonial period. The first notable part we see it in 1908 with the Food Ordinance, where in the different colonial factories, they shifted African consumption of small grains to say everyone should now eat maize. Then you have what we call the Maize Control Act, which came in and banned the production and marketing of small grains in preference for maize. So over time, this then meant that when people were selling food, selling their crops and their grains, maize was fetching higher prices on the market, whereas small grains did not have access to many markets. And so there was poverty amongst those who constantly grew small grains. And more recently, because of the nutritional value, as the rejuvenation of these ideas of small grains came about, they became the rejuvenation and association of consumption of small grains as being a healthy food, but consumed mainly with people who were suffering from HIV and AIDS. And so in the early 80s, there was a lot of stigma on just having the disease itself. And so when you are seen eating these foods, there was always this quick social trigger to say, okay, he's eating those foods because he's suffering from this. And it wasn't something that people wanted to be associated with. And so these historical ideas, social ideas, and economic ideas have lingered into people's mindsets and their everyday living. And more importantly, from the colonial period, you have maize being identified as Rhodesia's friend. Rhodesia in that time was Zimbabwe's name during the colonial period. And so these are things that then now became inherited by the post-colonial state. Um, some key takeaways, if anything happens to this presentation today, some of the few key takeaways that we should come up with is that the history of small grains shows us that grains are political. They have a political form. They're not just about consumption, because even who eats these grains and how they're eaten and how they're distributed speaks to a political story, whether it's at a mega level amongst the national politics, at a domestic level, where within African communities, not everyone was also allowed to eat the different varieties. Some would be said if they're eating sorghum, they're involved in witchcraft, and others used to use these small grains to brew beer. So they always be shunned upon by different people in the community. And so there's these contestations. And then also, amid hunger and poverty within the country and within the state, this hunger was leveraged by the political elites and the economical elites to take advantage of the different poor people who needed food. And so also, in doing this, you then also realize the local communities adopting different methods to survive and to try and circumvent and survive the hunger scourges that were taking place. And so food then gives us a lens, our small grains give us a lens to rethink the political history of the society and our different places. And so in Zimbabwe, coming closer to our Zimbabwean case, we witness what we call the agrarian political paradox. So since in the year 2000, Zimbabwe went through what we call the land reform program, which was well documented, where it was the Robert Mugabe government taking away farms from the former white commercial farmers who were the backdrop of the agricultural economy within Zimbabwean society. And so these white farmers used to grow a lot of maize, and that was the staple food and remains the staple food in the country. And so with the redistribution exercise that then took place, this land was now given to small black farmers. But the whole disruption of this whole program brought about a disruption in the agrarian pattern and the outputs that were going to take place. But also to now maintain this idea that this program was successful, you then see a heavy investment by the state into trying to support and maintain agriculture. And one of the key things that they did was to say that let us continue growing maize. As long as people have a lot of maize and people continue eating, the Western world would not have an idea that Zimbabweans are hungry. Unfortunately, at the same time when all this was taking place, we see the impacts of climate change seeping in, where you now have erratic rainfalls coming in. And with erratic rainfalls coming in, production of maize became very scarce and they dwindled. And so now the preferred crop to have been grown at the time should have been small grains. However, there's this contradiction shift that was now existing, that the white farmers were growing maize and people were eating and enjoying, there was no hunger. But as soon as you take the land away, all of a sudden you now have this hunger, and a shift over from maize to small grains would have sent signals, the wrong signals about the whole land reform exercise as a whole. And so the government tried to maintain the growing of maize through different support schemes, such as the presidential input scheme. But more importantly, you see the politicization of these different schemes, where party members were the ones that were being given support. Those who showed allegiance to the ruling government at that time. A seminal thing that happened also during this land reform program was the rising of a robust opposition party, which was arguably supported by the West, which was arguably also supporting the farmers, the white farmers whose land was taken away. So you see these political contestations where food and grain is now at the center of it, that anything that is all the farm mechanization programs and the food distribution that is being supported by the government was being given to party card carrying members. If you see in the picture, that green T-shirt is one of the T-shirts that is distributed, a common T-shirt by the ruling political party, and the bags of grain by the side are maize grains, which were being given to people to say that go and plow. And this was in a very dry and arid region. And so the state was now leveraging upon community hunger, because at the same time you had elections taking place. And so, because if you wanted to get food from the government, which was the one that had control of the food distribution, right, you had to support them. And so you then see an active leveraging of the state to say that if you are not attending our food rally, if you are not attending the presidential rally, you won't have access to food. And so you then see a lot of people now attending these rallies to just so they can get some food. But at the same time, on the other hand, the West was also sending some warning shots to the Zimbabwean Robert Mugabe government. You see the active interventions of organizations such as the Global Fund, USAID, and Euro aid from England coming in to support the hunger that was taking place from different, like the NGOs that were now operating. But essentially, what these NGOs then now came and did was they went and started distributing small grains. Although their justification was that small grains are healthier and they're more environmentally friendly. At the same time, this was a warning shot to say that any other country that wants to exercise any land reform program within the region, right, if you do not follow what we are saying, you are likely to also suffer as Zimbabwe is suffering, where we will shift your agrarian patterns, we will shift your agrarian narrative and your local narrative from the staple of maize that you guys know to what we feel is what we want. And this was essentially directed to South Africa, who at the time was also having these conversations of land without expropriation from the white farmers to the African farmers. And so you see these contestations where food is now coming at the center of all of this. And so essentially, again, the Robert Mugabe regime maintained that at their rallies and at their political gatherings, they'll distribute maize. So anyone who was seen eating small grains or anything other than maize was directly then now linked to getting support and aid from any Western organization. And these Western organizations were aligned and were arguably aligned with the opposition party. And so it now became a challenge. Consuming small grains now sort of became a challenge to the state. That was how it was now looked at a rudimentary level and at a fundamental level within and across society. But also during this time, the interesting thing, because as I said, the erratic rainfall patterns that also took place, you had the presidential schemes that were promoting maize not progressing as well, largely because of environmental factors. And you see small grains actually thriving in comparison. So if you look at this table, although maize production remained significantly high, it was a huge drop from its its era when it was being conducted by white commercial farmers. And you see a rise in small grain production taking place much larger than ever before. And you even have the market prices for small grains significantly growing over this period of hunger. And so then the story then becomes a narrative and an exchange, a contestation between the political systems, the different political systems trying to use food to control not only the social, but also the political narrative of people. And so I then centrally argue that small grains allow us a mirror into the contestations that existed within the deep-rooted politics of African governments and their quest for survival and their quest to control the different social and political narratives. And they also give us a mirror to reflect how crops amongst themselves are also always in contestations between themselves, where you have small grains which are environmentally friendly being pitted against maize, which was not doing so well within the ever-changing erratic landscape and the impact of climate change. So this story of small grains allows us to not just think about food as something that is consumed, but it allows us to think about food as a mirror into the contestations, social, economic, and environmental contestations that are everyday reality within our different African societies over time and space. I hope I managed to keep into the time that I was allocated, and I would really love for different opinions and suggestions, and to also just help me around with converting this into the book that I want it to be eventually. But thank you very much.
Thank you, Bryan. You are just punctual. So much, observing with in terms of time. Thank you so much. Exploring food as a political category. That's amazing. Thank you. So we will come back for the Q&A. Our second speaker is Jin Yong Park, is an artist and researcher. She is currently a PhD candidate at the School of Creative Media, City University of Hong Kong, not very far away from Taiwan. She holds an NFA in Creative Media from School of Creative Media, City University of Hong Kong, and a BA in Broadcasting from School of Film, TV, and Multimedia, Korea National University of Art. As a multimedia artist, she works with a lot of people in film, in video, in installation, photography, and the performance. Wonderful, wonderful experiences in all these fields. Her works have been exhibited in Seoul, Hong Kong, and Zurich, Europe and Asia. Her interests include multi-species relationship, plant interactions, more than humans, and ecofeminism. So, Jin Yong Park, please.
Thank you for the
Thank you.
wonderful introduction. And I try to share the screen. So do you see my presentation?
Yes,
file?
perfect, perfect. Yeah.
Thank you. So yeah, under the title Human as a Species in Agriculture Ecosystem, a case study of Vegelaboratory organic farming for vegetal sustainability, I will share a story of a small farm in South Korea. So I'm now living and studying in Hong Kong, but actually I'm South Korean, so I'd like to talk about a farm in South Korea. So to begin with, I have to share a little personal story because I started my doctoral study in 2019. Back then, I was generally interested in ecology topics in a multi-species level, such as sustainability from plants' perspective, urban ecology, urban farming, plant interactions, multi-species relationships, and indigenous knowledge. And that's the point when I wrote the proposal for this conference. And as you know, COVID happened and now is now. So I was interested and I am interested in multi-species relationships that can be shared via farming in the urban ecosystem. However, my research has developed to a bit different direction. So at the moment now, I have been working with local orchid species in Hong Kong. That is a bit far from the urban farming topic. But anyway, I have been keeping my interest in urban farming as a side project. So this presentation is about my side project. And there are many aspects that are interesting to me about urban farming and multi-species relationships. For instance, plant interactions in agriculture study analyzes multi-species relationships from science perspective to find solutions for sustainable food productions. On the picture you can see on the bottom. Then on the other hand, Robin Wall Kimmerer tells stories about indigenous knowledge of more than humans and how indigenous people grow crops that benefits not only humans but also the plants and ecosystem. And on the top left, the Mapopo Community Farm is one of the most iconic community farm in Hong Kong. Farmers interact with the land and plants. So urban farmers shape a new kind of multi-species relationship through farming in the cities, like Hong Kong, like cosmopolitan cities, where farming can mediate more than humans and humans. As a person who followed the topic and as a Korean citizen, I am very concerning a lot about the situation in Korea. Agriculture has been declined ever since the industrialization. And for the Korean government, agriculture is regarded more as an industry or a source of jobs as a method to produce money. So that possibly lead people to move back to rural area. And in 2022, you can see these Korean letters written here. that shows that only 3% of the entire national budget is planned for agriculture, which is already which is already an increase compared to the previous year. However, within the 3%, most of the budget is allocated to the price or productivity. And moreover, what you can see on the left side with the poster, that's a poster for recruiting participants for the funded project titled Plan Your Future with Agriculture Consulting. So it shows that government is significantly focuses more on the smart farm, which targets to increase productivity by utilizing technologies to control the farming environment for young people. Then, can we think of agriculture only as an industry? Or can we think of crops only as food? Farming is not something that just for producing food and money, in my opinion. And like urban farmers do in Hong Kong, I think it's substantial to think farming as a way to change human attitudes towards more than humans and take it as a chance to shape a sustainable relationship with plants. In this regard, I set research questions. First, how can farming be sustainable both for humans and plants? Second, how can humans engage with vegetal life? And lastly, how can farming nurture multi-species relationships? To find the answers, I researched small-scale and independent farms in Korea and learned how they approach to the farming culture. So Vegelaboratory is a small organic farm in Hongsong, South Korea, as you can see in the map here. Hongsong is especially famous for organic farming, farming education, community culture, especially for people who seek to return or move to countryside. Vegelaboratory is founded by a former primary school teacher, Mr. Park Hyung-il. And a few years later, fine art student Lee Yun-sun joined the farm after finishing her bachelor's study. The name of the farm, 채소 생활, in Korean literally means vegetable life or vegetal life. Through the farming and related activities, the farmers seek answers to the questions, what is a veggie-like life? And how can we live like vegetables? So Vegelaboratory started with growing various vegetables. In the community farm, farmers practice sustainable life and agriculture with 3 principles: appreciating the land, appreciating the circulation of life, and appreciating the biodiversity. Vegelaboratory farmers are not interested in increasing the amount of harvest. They focus on growing diverse vegetables in the right season. They produce only a few boxes of vegetables for the customers each season to introduce the biodiversity of vegetable. And with the veggies, farmers put information cards that explain the process of growing each crop, stories about them, and some recipes. The farmers believe that this can help others to comprehend and appreciate vegetables as a species, not just as an ingredient. So in this photos, it shows the planting the seed process, which also can other visitors or participants can also join. And this photo, it's the one of the farmer, Miss Lee, is planting the seeds here. And in this photo, you can see both of Mr. Park and Miss Lee. They are harvesting crops and then veggies for the box. And this is how they work as a relatively small farm and all the facilities. And the veggie story cards they put in the veggie box developed into a web article format called Monthly Vegetable. Vegelaboratory farmers believe that highlighting various stories of the vegetable help humans to understand veggies more as an individual being rather than just ingredient to consume. Therefore, Vegelaboratory explored the charm, mystery, excitement, meaning, style, and taste that each species has. Stories mediate humans to vegetal life. I'll show you an example from the story of potato that was published in March this year. So sorry for not providing the English translation of the whole article, but I could explain it to you. So in this page, it starts with explaining the history of potato. The first interaction with humans and potato is described on the right side of this page. Along with the travel history of potato that migrated to Korea by humans, this page of article introduces various potato species that are currently living in the farms in Gangwon province. And to end, it provides handful potato recipes as a method for humans to appreciate potato and the nutrition that potatoes are giving to humans. And lastly, the farmers opened the space for sharing and vegetal experience called Vegetable Library, a veggie library. Instead of naming it as an offline veg shop, they named it this space library. Farmers sell vegetables here, but they run this space more as a documentation of humans and vegetable interactions. Passers-by can come to experience veggies in a different atmosphere rather than supermarket. They can touch, smell, or observe vegetables. Also, people can learn recipes. Vegelaboratory farmers are still developing this place with the objectives of promoting vegetal life and sustainable agricultural ecosystem that are healthy for not only humans but also for plants. So this photo shows a class at the library. Farmers organize various activities that introduces cooking as an interspecies interactions as well as biodiversity and education. So in this board, there's a recipe of making the Italian frittata and how many ingredients can be used for the dish. And in this case, participating humans are the children. So the farmers let them to begin with harvesting the vegetables by themselves and give them plenty of time to interact with the plants. And then they bring all the things into the library and then start cooking together. But the class is consistently delivering Vegelaboratory's core idea that vegetables are not just the food. Or passers-by and visitors can write a story or draw pictures of the vegetables they see in the library. Or just as in the boy in this picture, people can just have a rest spending time and shaping relationships with vegetables and then plants that are growing in the surrounding environment. So when I search multi-species farming, it's very easy to find search results about multi-species rotational grazing, which is subject to boost capacity of the land, control weeds, and for other benefits to humans. However, I argue that it is very important to regard humans also as a species and pursue multi-species relationship within the agriculture ecosystem. We cannot put hierarchy, like species hierarchy, in this process. In multi-species relationships, humans are part of a larger interconnected web of agencies. And in this relationship, humans, animals, plants, and their interwoven relationships, communities, socialities, and culture are holistically coexists. I recognize the farming and related activities of Vegelaboratory farmers. This is an approach to agriculture as a method to shape multi-species relationships as well as to fertilize vegetal culture to humans. Agriculture in the Anthropocene, which has been developed to satisfy the market, has caused problems not only to animal livestock, but also to plant crops. Recently, sustainability and ethics have become a key idea to solve such problems in both agriculture and food cultures. I suggest employing multi-species relationships to farming culture can be a way to locate ourselves, humans in a circular relationship between farming and food, which is growing and receiving life. In this way, humans enable to continue farming practice more ethically and sustainably for the ecosystem. Unfortunately, I briefly mentioned earlier, in South Korea, farming is considered mostly as a way for earning money. Also, Vegelaboratory is undergoing hard time due to the land problem. The landlord and the property owner asked them to leave, so they have to move their space. And currently, Library is not operating. They are seeking a new space to set it up, and also the farming land is decreased, so they couldn't have enough space at the moment, which is very sad. But still, as far as I know, this is one of the very few farmers who practice farming as more as an activism at this time. And through the case study of Vegelaboratory, I acknowledge the farming as a critical practice for humans to start interacting and communicating with plants, sharing the vegetal experience of multi-species life. Therefore, enable us to participate in the plant-centered agriculture ecosystem as a species. And I try to keep continuing this research to find more cases of farming as a multi-species relationships in South Korea in the future. So thank you. This is the end of my presentation.
Thank you, Gio. That's wonderful. Whoever stayed with our program actually has been going through 2 years, as Gio just mentioned at the very outset of her presentation. And thank you for the persistency. And this is part of our responsibility to be persistent in terms of, giving a sustainable future for the many generations to come. So thank you for the patience and understanding everything. Not only is your research such an impressive outcome, but also the photos that you show us, you provided as a supplement text to your research are fascinating. So I think you will be able to set up a kind of art gallery, for the small farm. So smallness is beautiful. So we go from small grain in Zimbabwe to a small farm in South Korea. So our third speaker is going to take us to the small islands of the Pacific. So the third speaker, Dr. Anna Erzsebet, is a researcher at Tomorrow University of Applied Sciences in Germany. She received her master's degree in Hungarian literature at the University of Szeged, Hungary, and her PhD degree in American literature and comparative literature at National Science University, where I'm teaching, and she actually is my advisee. I am so very proud of her. And her PhD research under my supervision focused on Indigenous Pacific Islander literature with a special attention to activism in poetry. And currently, her research concentrates on sustainability and sustainable development in interdisciplinary fields. And she's interested in Indigenous eco-literatures and contemporary Indigenous cultural studies. Unfortunately, she won't be with us, concurrently today because of medical emergency. But she pre-recorded her presentation. So we are going to show her presentation, and suppose you do have any question, we are going to note it down and pass on to her. And I'm sure it's going to be very, very helpful for her to improve her work. So we have Pani Szucs. Okay, Kimi.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Pani Szucs. I am an alumni of National Yat-sen University, and I'm glad to be here with you, even if only virtually. And I'm looking forward to the presentations and discussions during the next few days. So, food is rarely only food. When I first read this in Michael Mikulak's work, I was living abroad for about 12 years already. And this sentence made me think of my favorite dishes from my mom's kitchen. But I didn't only think of the food itself, but also my family, my home, my country, the weather, the people, the culture, and so on. So the connotation that comes with food points further than the ingredient making up the certain dish. So let us see some of the meanings of food. Food enters and shapes most aspects of each culture. It is a unique part of material culture as it is connected to our actual survival. Even though food consumption is a fundamental act, it is never purely a biological one. Eating is a learned technique together with the unique ceremonies surrounding it, and it differentiates our group from other groups and cultures, so it is highly symbolic. Also, food is closely connected to our memory. Indigenous identities, for example, are often maintained and performed through food. Many groups use food during ceremonies, festivals, and at home to preserve ethnic identity. There is a strong link between ethnicity and food, and this link carries historical, social, cultural, economical, political, and psychological significance. Identity development is influenced by practices of food production and services, culinary creativities, appetites, desires, hunger, and many others. Food is immediately related to the construction and articulation of one's identity. Some particular food items even evolved to be a symbol of identity of a group. For example, taro or kalo in native Hawaiian has a deep meaning in Hawaiian culture. It is not only the main staple of the people, but also, according to mythology, taro is an old relative to the Hawaiians, and they are descended from him. Therefore, taro is not only food in this culture, but a large part of Hawaiians' identity. Food is an identity marker, which connects people to their home, even if they live abroad. It marks the differences between the two places, the here and the there, the original and the new home. Because of all these connotations and of what food represents, we can see that there is a strong power in food. So let's discover this power in indigenous food. And how do colonizers use indigenous food? Let's see that first. Due to being such a large component of constructing a culture, food has always been an important tool of colonial operations. One of the many methods of colonial actions is to wipe out indigenous culture, and a big part of it is the erasure of indigenous food systems. Food system is a significant angle to survival of indigenous collective relationships, and thus colonial powers always aim to eradicate it. Forced relocation is one of the causes of involuntary changes in indigenous foodways. Settlers have often removed indigenous groups from their lands, whether to restrict them into reservations like in North America, to take over their islands for burying nuclear waste in the case of the Marshall Islands, for instance, or to build military bases, as in Guam. These imposed movements have influenced many people's lives and their food production and consumption. As a result, they are deprived of the possibility to harvest, collect food, fish, and so on in the traditional way, and to carry out ceremonies which are linked to continuing established practices. Destroying the environment with modernization and development results in losing relationships between indigenous groups and plants, animals, insects, and entire ecosystems. Suffering from the loss of these relationships and physical unavailability of habitual resources can cause physical and mental health problems. Stories, language, cultural practices, interpersonal relationships, and outdoor activities implicated in those food systems are taken away. Also, environmental changes can severely influence traditional foodways. For instance, island communities are the most impacted groups of climate change. The environmental changes were brought to the island countries by settler colonialism and its development in the area, nuclear weapon testing, tourism, military extension, and so on. Colonialism has reshaped the landscape and seascape of the world. As a result of sea level rising, lands are taken away by saltwater, preventing planting and harvesting traditional crops. Activities result in extinction of many indigenous species, which means they are forever erased from indigenous foodways and the ceremonies, customs, art, and everyday life in general that related to them. So after looking at how colonialism used and influenced indigenous foodways, let's see how indigenous communities use food for their own purposes. Opposed to food injustice, indigenous groups seek food sovereignty. Food sovereignty is a term defined at the 2007 Forum for Food Sovereignty in Mali. It is the right of peoples to healthy and cultural appropriate food produced through ecologically sound and sustainable methods, and their right to define their own food and agricultural system. It is a norm protecting independence and self-reliance of a group and to have the freedom of choice and decision-making. It is directly related to decolonization. It is the indigenous right to their traditional land and cultural practices surrounding food gathering and production. Indigenous groups should be the ones making agricultural decisions and policies simply only because they have the right to do so. Food sovereignty efforts are anti-colonial efforts. Some specific foods are connected to the ability to practice self-determination, so food injustice is not only the violation of food sovereignty, but also indigenous sovereignty. Therefore, since food is a symbol and practice, a way of passing on traditional knowledge, an act of decolonization, and also the way groups see and declare connection to a certain place, we can argue that continuing to cook and eat indigenous food as an everyday act of resistance and resurgence. Let's talk about how indigenous authors present food in their literary works. Land rights, food injustice, and food sovereignty are often the main themes of indigenous literature. These literary pieces illustrate the effects of the colonial methods of controlling and eradicating native foodways, the reaction of natives' refusal to entirely follow colonial food choices and food production, and also the continuance of practicing indigenous sustenance, recovering and cultivating traditional food production, and reclaim food sovereignty. Food, when placed in literary texts, carries extra meaning of preservance, continuity, and resistance, and thus its presence in literature can be perceived as activist messages that critique colonial and post-colonial conditions. Indigenous authors criticize food injustice in their works, demand food sovereignty, and offer solutions to the modern issues employing indigenous knowledge. Now, let's look at some examples from Pacific Island writers, from Katie Jetner-Kitchener, Brandon Nalani McDougall, and Sia Figiel. And first we will look at, we will read passages from two authors that write about indigenous food. Katie Jetner-Kitchener from the Marshall Islands explores traditional food and food knowledge as part of one's self-determination and as an indigenous person in this poem. Let's read it together. I cannot read Marshallese well, so I will just read the translation, the English translation. You will often be questioned by other Marshallese, especially those born and raised at home. Do you know how to fish? I don't know. Can you teach me? Do you know how to pick coconuts? I don't know. Can you teach me? Do you know how to cook breadfruit in the earth? I don't know. Can you teach me? I'm not an expert, but I can try. From this poem, we can see how traditional food practices and knowledge can connect people to each other and to the homeland. Speaker A, most probably born and raised on the Marshall Islands, is questioning Speaker B, who seems to be a Marshallese living abroad and wishing to strengthen his or her connections with the ancestry through language, food, and personal contact. Knowledge of fishing, harvesting, and cooking a traditional meal are presented as some kind of measurements of one's ability to identify as a Marshallese, to be part of the indigenous community. Speaker A is challenging Speaker B and making him or her believe that belonging is only possible if he or she acquires expertise in these practices. The poem ends on an ambiguous note. At first, the reader understands that the last line, the offer of teaching Speaker B all these techniques, is a way to reconnect him or her to the community. It certainly is positive and shows kinship. However, after the questioning, Speaker A admits that he or she has forgotten segments of the tribal knowledge, but still is willing to try and pass on as much of it as he or she can remember. Therefore, the ending of the poem can be read with negative representation as well, as it seems that the full knowledge of food harvesting and preparation cannot be recovered fully, as there is no expert, no one to remember it entirely. Let us look at another poem, this time from Brandie Nalani McDougall. In this poem, she recalls her own experiences of living away from her homeland, Hawaii. In the poem, titled On the Routing Slip from the U.S. Postal Service to Kalani Branch, she explores food as the link that connects her to her home and her family. Received 7th of April 2002 after careful inspection in New Zealand. Brandy, this poi was frozen. Hopefully it will keep until it gets to you. You will need to microwave it, like how I told you, with water. Hope it's not too sour. Maybe I will send a fresh poi next time. Love you, Grandpa. The short poem shows how poi, the Hawaiian staple food made from the plant stem of the taro, acts as a link that connects people and places. The grandfather doesn't write anything else in his letter to his granddaughter. He only mentions this meal. Sending the poi is his way of showing love and care. With this package, he ensures his granddaughter is connected to him and their homeland. He's passing on traditional knowledge by teaching the young woman how to prepare the poi, adding water and microwave the mixture. But we can see that modernity and technology are inevitable, and they have already influenced the older generation too. The poet employs the staple food to show the persistence of her people. Hawaiians in diaspora carry traditions and food with them, and together they ensure the survival of the culture. Although customs are altered by modern technology, like preparing traditional food in the microwave, Hawaiians can adapt to new conditions, and that's why they can survive and thrive. And the last last example I brought you is from Western food, reading the enemy's food, that's how I called it. So Sia Figia is a Samoan writer. She presents a hopeless future for the Samoans through describing Western food as so-called death food. Her novel, Where We Once Belonged, ends on a very negative note as one of the characters commits suicide. And these are her parting words. Let's read it together. Suicide, it is the only way. Each time a child cries for Coca-Cola instead of coconut juice, the waves close into our lungs. Each time we open Supakeli, Pisupo, Elegi instead of fishing nets, raising pigs, growing taro plantations, tamu, breadfruit. Each time we prefer apples to mangoes, pears to mangoes, strawberries to mangoes, suffocate our babies with formula milk, baby powder, bottled baby food, and a nuclear bomb once in a while. And Agaga, as we once knew it, dies in our still biologically functionable bodies, full of junk food, darkness food, white food, death food. For that is what we consume on a daily basis. We eat death and we are eaten by death too. The unhealthy food choices of Samoans and Pacific Islanders in general are not entirely their faults, and Figia blames both sides. Samoans for choosing Western food over local, and the colonizers for invading Samoa with their death food, which is being given from the beginning of one's life. As we see, the baby drinks fake milk instead of being breastfed. The author doesn't give solution to the problems. Actually, the speaker in the novel couldn't find one either, as she rather escaped it with suicide. Only places food, Western and Samoan, side by side, and lets the reader deal with them, understand the consequences, and decide what future steps to take in this regard. And in conclusion, indigenous writers and poets are raising their voices to speak up against colonialism, and in many cases, they mention food to show the negative conditions caused by colonial powers and imply that indigenous groups need to change by reaching back to the roots, reaching back to indigenous food. They blame Western food for mental and physical health problems, loss of identity, interruption of culture and traditions, and see the solution in the strong connection to indigenous foodways. Calling attention to the problems related to non-indigenous food and giving voice to indigenous plants and food are ways of activism that are clearly presented in literary works. While Western food represents the destructive colonial culture that dispossess them, indigenous food symbolizes continuance of culture, traditions, customs, and the endurance of the indigenous groups. Yes, and these are my references to this presentation. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Pani. Even though she's not here, I have to acknowledge her talent. She always touched me when she was with me doing her PhD, and this one is as much moving as her work previously. Not only did she touch upon the issues faced by the indigenous people in diaspora and food, provide a kind of connection with their losing kind of, or lost home islands, but also food in this case, tell the touching stories that move our heart and somehow hurt our heart, that show us the urgent issues of food futures, which is the topic of this current conference. So the floor is open. We have two very talented young scholars with us, and artists as well. So I'm really, really thankful, for your being here, particularly going through the past 2 years. So the floor is open. please don't hesitate to raise your hand, or if you hesitate to talk, you just, post in the chat box. Yes. Do we have a hand? Okay. Professor Johnny Adamson from ASU. Johnny, please. Hello? Hello?
I'm on mute, sorry.
Okay, Johnny, please. Professor Adamson.
Yeah, I wanted to make maybe a comment on each of the papers and just talk to them about maybe who some of their sources are. And I was wondering, Bryan, about your paper. First, I want to thank you for your paper. It's really smart. And I just got back from South Africa, a conference a couple weeks ago, and we heard papers that by young early career scholars that I would love to introduce you to some of the young scholars that I met, because I think that they would be part of your network. But I was really interested in how you were connecting the small grains with AIDS and that kind of stigma. And I've also sort of in my own research been interested in the ways in which what I call drought foods or drought grains also get associated with poverty. And even though they're the, greens that we probably should be growing now, because especially in places that tend to drought, we're not growing them. So millet and sorghum, in other places it would be, amaranth and greens like that. And I was wondering if you, two things. I was wondering if you have done any research that also looks at that stigma around poverty and drought, or, sometimes what's called hunger grains or drought grains, or, dry grains. And whether or not you have ever looked at the work of Andrew Mashita or worked with Andrew Mashita. And if not, I would just recommend him. But yeah, I'm interested in what you're thinking about this association between drought and poverty.
Okay, thank you, Professor Adamson.
Well, so I asked Bryan a question.
Oh, okay. So Bryan.
Oh yes.
Okay. All right.
Do I answer them right now, or you wanted to collect the questions?
Sure. I could just make the comments to everybody, and then everybody could comment. Is that what you were thinking, Hsinya? If so,
yes, that would be good. Thank you. And Professor Anderson.
Okay, and then with let's see, with Ji Yung. I'm sorry if I mispronounced your name. I was also really interested in whether or not you might have also worked with Anna Singh's work, and her. I sort of think that maybe everything she's written, might be, work that would be great for your, but I also want to thank you for your paper. That was really interesting to just think about, what's going on in South Korea, especially economically, as opposed to multi-species ways of thinking about agriculture. So I just want to congratulate you on that multi-species approach. And then with Anna, I think that's not what you called her. I think you called her Pani.
That's her name. Pani is her name.
And with Pani, of course, I would just recommend that she look at the work of Erzsebet de Logri, especially roots and routes. So that's just a comment for her. But yeah, we could maybe go back to Bryan and Ji Yung.
Okay, so Bryan, please.
Oh, okay. Thank you, Johnny, for the very insightful comments. The nexus, the AIDS, where I associate the AIDS in particular with the small grains, medically, small grains have been proven to be scientifically more healthier, and they're good for the body, and they boost your immune system. And so in the early years when AIDS was first discovered in Africa, there was a lot of uncertainty, just like with the COVID virus. The early phase of conspiracies that come about, right? And so the thing that then happened, they realized that, oh, okay, to boost one's immune system, they have to eat these grains. So it wasn't even an issue of saying that this is based on real realities, so to speak, but an already existing stigma that was associated with the small grains. Unfortunately, I didn't put a picture in the slide, but it's also an issue of whiteness that is also now coming in. When the cooked maize is white, the staple food was white, but the small grains, whenever you cook them, they become this dark color. So it was these contestations of ideas of associating everything bad with this crop. And so it was now just a social stigma as well that was now being developed and perpetuated amongst people, that if you see someone carrying or eating food that brown mealie meal, it means they're sick, you see. And because the fear that lingered amongst people about the disease and how it spread, there's this whole ostracization that then takes place between people, not necessarily based on any science, but a period of a general lack of knowledge amongst us as a society at that time. And that also then comes in the drought element, and that part that you do speak about, the hunger grains, where the association of saying that you're eating this because you don't have, or you're eating this because you're poor, it's always been, because humans are also social beings. Despite their reality of being poor, no one wants to be described as being poor, especially amongst other certain social spaces. And so even though the grains were not fetching that much on the market, there's a lot of ideas of poverty that continue to linger, because the government kept on saying from the colonial period right up to the post-colonial, saying that if you're a good farmer, the standard and the benchmark was producing white maize. If you produce these small grains, it means you're staying in an arid area where there's no water, where there's poverty and sickness. And so, although it was their reality, it was something that you see people trying to always contest and fight against. Although this has since changed over time in the more recent years, those whole vegan and agrarian revolution and the Anthropocene taking place. But for the period which we're looking at, these are some of the challenges that faced everyday people. And thank you for the reference of Andrew Rosita. I'm not sure of the spelling of the surname.
I'm going to spell that for you because he's a very famous seed bank guy in Zimbabwe.
Oh, okay.
And he works with Carol Thompson. So they have a number of books out. I put it in the chat. I think he's going to be somebody that
okay.
that
yes.
you really like to meet. Yeah.
Yes. Thank you very much for that. Thank you very much. To be honest and fair, I must admit, I've been reading so many books and so many things, seen so many names. At some point in time, you'd have read the person's work, but it's not consciously inside your mind. But this
Yes.
one, yes, thank you. I still appreciate it very much. Thanks very much for that.
Yeah. You probably have read him, I'm sure, but if you haven't, he's a great guy to meet.
Thank you.
Okay, Zhiyong, please.
Yeah, thanks for the comment. And yeah, I read a lot of Yat-sen because it's also related to my main work. And as I kind of mentioned, that it's my side project, and I cannot spend too much time on my side project, but actually it's really what's happening in South Korea regarding farming and agriculture. So yeah, I hope that I can dig more into this topic. Thank you.
Yeah, multi-species approach is an excellent approach. Yeah.
Okay, so we do have Professor Yalan Zhang. Professor Zhang, please.
Okay. Hello. I have a question for Jin Yong. Okay. Because I think I was fascinated by your talk. Okay. I found you and I have a very similar research interest on, how multi-species notion could be applied in organic farming in your case. And also natural farming in the case that I will explain tomorrow in my group. And so I'm going to ask you a question that, I'm always confronted when I introduce the idea of organic farming, or, natural farming to some friends. Because as we know that organic farming or organic farming productions are always, more pricey than the conventional agriculture production, right? So not everybody can afford it, okay? Well, so I'm curious, how do you see this class problems in talking about organic farming? People struggling to make ends meet may not afford to buy, organic production. Okay, so I'm curious about your opinions on that. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. Yes, it is true. And then because I'm currently living in Hong Kong, organic food it's really expensive there. So only expats maybe they are able to afford it. And also in Korea, organic food is not cheap as well. And also keeping organic farming itself, it's difficult for the farmers too, financially. So it's very hard. And also I have a bit, it's maybe my personal difficulty to introduce organic farming kind of topic because it's kind of fancy and hip culture for the young people. And earlier we talked about this gender or racial bias in agriculture and food, and mostly also people who consume organic farming food is women, mothers who try to keep providing healthy food for the babies, or young women who keep fit. So it's maybe I'm not really how to say, I'm not be able to give you the clear answer, but I'm just sharing my struggling as well. So it's at some point I almost thought it's kind of deception to talk about organic farming to certain people, and it's still and one way to approach it is the multi-species topic, the approach that I just introduced. So maybe it's still I'm on a way to find the answer for your questions too. Maybe your question is my question. Yeah.
Well, good. Thank you. I think we have very good experience in the United States. So concerning organic farming, how can sort of, the cost for organic farming be more affordable, to even to the underprivileged people. So I'm not quite sure either Professor Adamson or Sally Kitch, Professor Sally Kitch has anything to say about this organic farming, the cost?
Yes, I have a lot to say about this. and maybe Sally does too. Organic farming is just a brand. It's quote unquote a brand. So if a food gets branded organic, it's going to be more expensive, in part because there's all these regulatory procedures and around it. So you have to have organic or pesticide-free soils for a number of years, and for most farmers that's really too expensive. And so one of the things that I tell my students is that if a product is local, it's probably just as quote unquote organic as anything organic. So if you're looking for the affordable, healthy foods, probably you're going to look for something local because it hasn't been shipped a long way. And usually local farmers tend to be more healthy, grow their foods in a little bit more healthy way than monocultural industrial farmers do. So the question about organics is a really good question. it is higher priced in most places. And so if you're a mom, say, looking for that healthy food so that you can feed your babies healthy food, you might be looking maybe for local foods instead of quote unquote organic foods. So that's just one way to answer the question, but there could be others.
I also see Professor Sally Kitch's hands. Are you going to talk about organic farming, or do you have a question? Then you have to go after Yiping. So Professor Kitch.
I was going to talk about organic.
Okay. All right.
Farming.
Thank you. Thank you. Please. Yeah.
You raised the issue of access to organic foods or healthy foods, and I think Joni's answer about thinking about local as opposed to organic is probably wonderful advice. But we do have a problem of access to healthy food in the United States. And I think that the presentation that we gave earlier today pointed towards some of the reasons. There's a terrific connection between food deserts, where there is a huge lack of healthy, nutritious foods, and minority communities or impoverished communities. So one of the things that, there are a couple things that are happening that I think have improved that and are methods that other societies might consider. One is the CSA, the community boxes of produce that people can buy fairly reasonably and support organic farmers at the same time, or healthy farmers, local farmers at the same time. You don't have 100% control over what you get sometimes in those boxes, but they are available in urban areas, and they are more available for urban communities of minority communities or poorer communities, as opposed to farmers markets, which tend to be in suburban areas, although Phoenix has worked hard to get farmers markets in the middle of urban spaces. And so that kind of thing, including at ASU. I don't know if it's still happening since the pandemic, but ASU is a city unto itself with over 50,000 students on campus, plus staff and faculty. So it behooves farmers to actually set up those markets or some access to their produce on a campus where people would be willing to buy that kind of food. But getting access also is in the hands of some of these communities themselves. And when we were researching accessibility to nutritious food for our panel, I discovered that there are many communities, even urban communities, where mothers in particular, but a lot of women, sort of get together and form a carpool so that they can go to a place outside of their food desert to purchase more nutritious, locally grown food. So some of this is happening from the grassroots, but it would be very much better if these things were systemically produced and available. I think Joni's point again about price being connected with this labeling of organic, that if we encourage urban farming and if we encourage the relationship between local growers and the community, that we can get around some of the expense questions.
Thank you. Thank you for this round of conversation on organic farming and organic food. So Professor Yiping Liang, Professor Liang, please.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Wonderful. I apologize. I don't have a camera because I'm using the smartphone. But anyway, I would like to address my comments to the second presenter, Jing Yun. I guess it's wonderful that you gave us, a Vegetal laboratory, right? Which is a real life example of alternative farming in Korea. In Taiwan, we also have a similar organization, and I think that's very lots of people are familiar, which is Taiwan 主妇联盟, a Taiwan housewife co-op. They were established back in 1993 and started with 100 families getting together, trying to get healthy, clean, nutritious food. And in the last 21 years, they have grown from the original 100 families to 80,000 families across the island. And altogether, right now, in the last 21 years of the co-op, especially made by originally housewives, they support about 300, small farmers. So this is very much at the core of this panel, especially this alternative farming, small farming on a small scale, and everything done in the, as much natural as possible way. So I just recently became a member of this co-op and get to know a little bit of their history, their practice, and their mission, their sense of mission, trying to establish a sustainable and more healthy and more communal farming, and also family, human, and also plants interaction, in a way, alternative farming, but on the other hand, yeah, it reminds me of this, new call for paper, reclaiming the common. Yeah. So locally, we have had this wonderful co-op, right? This wonderful Vegetal laboratories that I think, can be used as a point of reference if you were to develop further your project, although you say this is only, more of a secondary nature in your larger work. So I think, this might be helpful. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. I will definitely look into this co-op in Taipei. Could you please be able to chat the name exactly?
Sure. English is called Taiwan Housewife Co-op.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, you Google, I'm sure you'll find it. I just checked their website. They have bilingual website.
That's good.
Give you all, everything that you would like to know, including their latest copy of their newsletter.
Oh, wonderful.
Yeah.
Thank you.
They've been in existence for 21 years, since the 1993.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that's helpful.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Liang. Yeah, I'm a member of the housewife clubs as well. So when my son was little, I get all the food delivered to my household. And sometimes they also sent a mother to cook the veggie for us, so that dinner is always ready. Yeah, when we were at home. Yeah. Exactly. So yeah. Okay. All right. So do you have any more questions from the audience or comments, feedback? No?
Well, I'll just say one more thing.
Sure. Edison? Yes.
I think one of the really key takeaways out of today's session should be that the world needs to be looking towards those drought-tolerant grains that Bryan talked about, especially as the rivers dry up in some places, and then, in places like Pakistan, people are getting washed away because the glaciers are melting so quickly. So yeah, we need to be looking at those drought tolerant greens that Bryan is talking about. The grandmas of the world have always tucked those grains into their clothes, into their hems, into their hair, and they've protected those seeds. And so, we should honor their wisdom and be looking towards those drought tolerant grains. So thanks everyone today for the incredibly interesting papers, and to Bryan for talking about those grains that are going to be so important to our future.
Thank you, Johnny. You make concluding remarks to not only this panel, but for the past 3 days, series of online presentations, wonderful panels, and that set up certain kind of, foundation for further conversation. For the next 2 days, it's going to be in-person venue in National Science Education Center. So if you are around Taiwan, please come and join us. Typhoon probably won't be coming because as I look out the window, there's no wind at all. So that's okay. From my experience, I have been living in this island, for decades and decades, and I know exactly what typhoon will come or not. So I will see everybody tomorrow, hopefully, all right, in National Science Education Center for the online, for the in-person presentation, but at the same time, we have online, so the meeting room as well, and live streamed. So please join us in whatever means that you can reach us, either in person or remotely from other parts of the world. I wish you every success, and thank you so much for being with us, and look forward to the next 2 days of program. So thank you. So I see you tomorrow.
Thank you.
Enjoy the rest of the day. Bye
Sure, see you all
bye.
tomorrow.
Bye bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye bye. Ciao.
Ciao.